So, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Maddie Duke, and on behalf of ABA Technologies, I want to thank you for being here. At ABA Technologies, we partner with small and medium-sized organizations to solve real performance problems. We do this by helping organizations build better training systems and by ensuring those systems actually translate into meaningful behavior change. In the context of today's webinar, we will be focusing on RBT professional development and professional skills. I'm very excited to introduce today's presenters. First, Danielle LaFrance, Customer Success Manager, brings over 23 years of experience working with individuals with developmental disabilities and more than a decade of leadership experience in behavior analytics service organizations. Danielle has led clinical teams, developed scalable service delivery systems, and mentored dozens of future BCBAs through internship programs that she helped establish. Her professional interests include verbal behavior, generative programming, discrimination and staff training, and she is deeply committed to the science of behavior analysis. Danielle has contributed extensively to the field through research, publications, conference presentations, and editorial service, and she has been recognized with multiple awards for her clinical supervision and scholarly work. Joining her is Adam Hochman, Senior Vice President of Learning Partnerships and Growth at ABA Technologies. Adam is an instructional designer who specializes in building learning and performance systems that improve professional practice. He plays a key role in developing corporate training programs and educational technologies, drawing on experience across private education settings and specialized healthcare environments. Adam's work focuses on bridging the gap between training and real-world performance. We're excited to have both of them with us today. Without any further delay, let's get started.
Thank you, Maddie, and good to see all of you here. We're excited to kick off our 2026 Clinical Autism, Clinical ABA webinar series. And today we're going to start a journey that's going to take us over the next 6 or 7 months where we really dive into the professional development requirement for RBTs and technicians in your organization by actually going and looking really deeply at some content areas. So today we're talking about professionalism, but in the months ahead, we're going to talk about meeting that PDU requirement and doing it around topics like verbal behavior, skill acquisition, prompting, error correction, behavior management, and so forth. If this is the first time with us, we encourage you to check out some of our previous webinars. These are all hosted on our YouTube page. You can just search ABA Technologies. We did about 5 or 6 of these at the end of last year. Everything from assessing training systems and evaluation metrics to training strategies that you can use when delivering the 40-hour training and professional development. We're really excited. We've been talking about for the last couple of months, but we're really excited in February. We're going to be launching the Clinical Leaders Community. This is a place where we really expand on these webinars, and it's a place for those of you who oversee clinical training. You might be an RBT lead who delivers training. You could be a BCBA who is a supervisor but is involved in training and supervision in some capacity. It's also a place for training directors and chief clinical officers to talk about and have resources around and continuing education around training, supervision, and performance systems. A lot of people that do training in ABA fall into the role first having been a behavior analyst, and then they're overseeing an entire training department or training function. And there are a lot of different capabilities that you don't learn in your BCBA training that are required to run a successful training department. And so we're going to talk about a lot of those things in this community. It's a place to connect with us, ABA Tech folks who do training systems with agencies of all sizes and specialty areas all the time, as well as your own, the community members that join. It's a place to ask questions, share resources, attend events. We're going to host a lot of events. We're going to have exclusive podcasts to people who join the community, blogs, tools that you can download, checklist, evaluation forms. We've got some short courses in there that expand on a lot of the topics that we've been talking about over these last several months. It's really a place to expand on the whole literature around training and development, behavior-based instructional design, and doing it with people that are specifically focused on how it applies in clinical ABA. The community is going to cost 150 for the year. You can contact us if you want to buy a subscription for multiple team members. As part of that, you can earn up to 16 continuing education credits for the BCBA. We haven't really added in, those for the RBT. But however, if you are an RBT and you oversee training and you want to join the community, let us know and we'll figure out a way to provide some supporting PDUs. In the community, we will also have live events, Q&As, monthly Q&As, where you can ask us questions or submit questions ahead of time, journal clubs. We're also going to do live training critiques where you can submit pieces of training and get our feedback on them, and people can learn from that. Or we'll show you some pieces of different kinds of training that we've found over our time in working with various clients, as well as workshops on a lot of the foundational skills of developing a training program. One of the products that we developed last year, and it's really exciting to start implementing it with clients and then also getting it out there. It's kind of the focal point of our series of webinars is ProTech. It's a product that addresses very specific areas of professional development for RBTs. So, for example, when RBTs first come onto the job as part of their 40-hour training, they learn about prompting, prompt fading. They learn about different hierarchies of prompting, what it looks like in programming. But if you're an RBT and you get assigned to one client and you work with one or two clients for, let's say, 2 or 3 months, and then you move to a different client or you move into a treatment environment where you're rotating between clients, all their various kinds of programs and protocols may involve different kinds of prompting techniques that you've not learned or you have never practiced. So ProTech is a product that really tries to both reintroduce some of those key concepts and expand on those. So I'm going to show you an example from prompting where we've got short micro lessons. They're online that learners complete. They go through them. There are lots of video examples, hands-on practice in the module that they get to reinforce those concepts, and then supervisors get a guidebook that goes along with that. So every supervisor for every topic area, there's a supervision handbook. That handbook provides ideas around what you might talk to your trainees about related to the topics they're going through in the course. It gives you ideas of how to do hands-on practice during group supervision. It gives you some sample scenarios, some procedural fidelity checklist and data collection tools. And all of those are ways to really embed professional development into the flow of work. One of the things that we've talked about in some of our previous webinars is just this little visualization that depicts the importance of making sure that professional development is not just a continuing education course like it often is at the BCBA level. Many BCBAs go on to, any number of continuing ed providers or to conferences, and they take several CEs to meet their CEU requirement. And then organizations may also provide on-grounds CEUs like clinical forums or monthly meetings. And then there's not really a measure of whether anyone goes and does anything with that stuff. You may even get some practice during the CEU event, but there's not a lot of opportunity to apply it. Well, that is not really super effective, as you probably know from having done your own continuing education, but it's even less effective for people that are at different education levels, different experience levels, which really applies to the frontline technician role. So what we're trying to advocate for is that when you go and do professional development, it may begin with a professional development event, an instructor-led training. It may begin with a module from our ProTech. But then you start embedding into the flow of work, into your morning meetings, supervision contacts, follow-up events, when you're working on the cases, when you're doing direct supervision of cases, or you're doing case reviews, when you're providing coaching on implementing procedures, that throughout all of the work that you do, you're weaving in the skills and the content that have been brought up as part of the professional development program. And then you're providing extension for it so that people can really see how all of this begins to apply in what they're doing on the job. And so ProTech is a product, but broadly, professional development in ABA companies should really be focused around getting every supervisor, everyone in the clinic wrapped around some of these important competency areas, having aligning training tools, supervision tools, activities, discussions, all those kinds of things, doing that in a way that's going to create lasting change. And when we get to the end of this presentation and talk more about training and sustainability of what you end up training, we're going to talk about some of those strategies that you can go out and implement, whether you're a one-shop ABA group where you're the supervisor, you're the owner, you're the trainer, you are everything, to multi organizations with 50 sites. All of these strategies sort of apply across the board. So what I'm going to do now is hand it over to Danielle, who's going to talk specifically about the content related to professionalism, some things we know from what we have to train on related to the BACB test content outline and curriculum guide, the ethics code, what we know are really important areas of professionalism that we've seen in our practice. And then we'll talk about some training implications around that.
Perfect. Thank you, Adam, and thank you everyone for being here. So, as we kind of touched upon last year, our webinars focused on a variety of topics related to technician level training. But over the next 6 months, we're really going to start zooming into the professional development requirements for RBTs. And we're going to review some of the core content to address within an RBT skill area and provide some training and supervision tips. But this month, we're going to focus on professionalism skills. So let's start by talking about a few of the big goals that we might want to accomplish when training our technicians on professionalism or professional conduct skills. The first is likely around imparting our new technicians with an understanding of their role and what exactly this means. And this might be focused on getting them to clearly understand and act in accordance with their scope of competence to ensure that they're practicing within the boundaries of their role. This should also include orienting them to the certification process or what steps to take specifically to both get and then maintain their certification. The second one is pretty obvious, and that's teaching new technicians what professional behavior actually looks like on the job. And this likely encompasses both general professional behavior and any company-specific expectations. Finally, the third area is likely focused on feedback. And this might mean helping new technicians reframe their understanding of feedback from a behavior analytic perspective so that they come to understand both the purpose and function of feedback, how to appropriately receive feedback given to them, and then how to appropriately deliver feedback to others if they're called to do so. So we'll dig into each in a bit more detail, and then what we'll do is we'll circle back around to these big ideas when we discuss considerations and some common challenges, so we can put this into the perspective of how to plan for and train effectively for all these skills in a way that actually sticks. So let's start with training new technicians to understand their role. Given the requirements for new technicians to obtain their position and the probability that many new technicians are new to the workforce or have never worked in a capacity like the one they currently find themselves in, it's likely very helpful to help them contextualize their role as that of a professional, right? They fit into a professional field. This means that they need to understand where they fit in the grand scheme of things and how their day-to-day activities and actions impact their clients, coworkers, supervisors, the company, and the profession as a whole. This also means that they need to understand not only that they will play multiple roles, but also how to act in accordance with those roles. So here again, it's likely helpful to orient them to their roles as therapeutic agent, supervisee, and role model and leader. And I know it sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but bear with me. So in doing so, it needs to be clear to them what each role means, right? So as a therapeutic agent, they need to understand that they're going to be spending the most time with clients and caregivers, that they're going to be delivering services via treatment implementation and data collection, that they'll have a direct impact on client and caregiver outcomes via that work, and that they can have an indirect impact on perceptions of ABA as a profession as a whole. As supervisees, they need to understand that they can't practice absent a supervisor, that their supervisor is ultimately responsible for all of their responsibilities and actions, and they need to know how to take an active role in supervision. For example, being receptive to feedback, and we'll talk about this more momentarily, identifying their own areas of need, and soliciting help, support, and feedback from their supervisor or supervisors if they're working with multiple. They also need to understand that they need to follow the direction of their supervisor. So if their supervisor gives them feedback, they need to then go and implement that feedback and continue to implement in accordance with that feedback. They need to understand how to maintain open and frequent communication with supervisors, such as discussing questions and concerns or raising those to their supervisor's attention. And they need to know and act in accordance with the scope of their role. So this means knowing what falls outside of the scope of the role, such as client programming, versus what they're actually responsible for, which is some of those technical skills and communication. As a role model and leader, they need to know that they can serve in this capacity whenever they're with others, whether they see themselves this way or not. And they need to understand that others observe them, such as newer technicians, and those newer technicians might actually imitate their behavior, right? Those newer technicians might look at them and go, well, they've been around longer and they're doing XYZ, which means I should do XYZ. So they need to be understanding and mindful of modeling professional and ethical behavior at all times to ensure they're representing themselves and the profession well, as well as ensuring that they're always acting in the best interest of their clients. Now, when training new technicians, it's also important that they understand their primary responsibilities, which consist of delivering medically necessary services to clients, delivering treatment with a high degree of fidelity, meaning they're implementing any protocols as written and intended by their supervisors, collecting accurate data, accurately completing all required documentation, such as session notes or anything else beyond session notes and data, modeling treatment implementation and professional behavior for others, which may include other technicians or team members, as well as caregivers, and ensuring ongoing communication with supervisors when any questions or concerns arise. In addition, it's important that new technicians gain a clear understanding of the boundaries of their role. So providing clear, real-world examples can help with this, as can lists of do's and don'ts and resources such as decision guidelines or decision trees. It's also important to train new technicians on how to both get and maintain certification. So they need to understand that upholding the ethics code means not just being familiar with it, but developing an applied understanding of it, which is best developed through practice. They also need to be crystal clear on the fact that they can only perform their technician responsibilities under the close and ongoing supervision of a supervisor who meets all supervision requirements. So they also need to know what those requirements are. So they need to understand not only what those requirements are, but also how to check for them or how to ask about them, right? And they need to know what it means to work with a supervisor, which entails maintaining open and frequent communication, soliciting that help from their supervisor. So they need to know how to ask for help, receiving feedback from their supervisor, implementing their super's feedback, providing feedback to others, and maybe most scary of all, providing feedback to their supervisors. Finally, new technicians need to be oriented to what it means to maintain their certification. And this entails knowing the BACB requirements, maintaining familiarity with all BACB requirements, assisting them in documenting their supervision appropriately in a timely manner, and orienting technicians to all resources such as the RBT handbook, ethics code, BACB website, portal, registry, and newsletters, as well as where and how to access them. Okay, that was all just our first goal, which is to teach new technicians to understand their role. Now, let's move on to teaching new technicians professional skills. And I'd like to reiterate here that given the requirements to become a technician, for many, this may be their first professional position. So we need to remember this and approach teaching them these skills in the same way we would teach any new skill to any learner. This being said, the focus in this goal will likely be on teaching new technicians organization skills so they can effectively manage materials, technology, and documentation, teaching new technicians how to organize their time both in and out of session so they can effectively and efficiently execute all their responsibilities, and teaching new technicians how to behave professionally with integrity. Additionally, this will also mean that new technicians will need to understand the professional expectations that may be specific to the company in which they work. And this is generally done via some sort of orientation, such as a new hire orientation, and can be quite policy and procedure heavy. And here's the final broad goal, feedback. Here again, I think it's important to remember that new technicians are often also new to the workforce. In addition, they all bring their own histories of learning when it comes to feedback, and for many, this can have a negative connotation. So it's likely helpful to help new technicians understand what feedback means from our behavior analytic perspective. What I mean by this is that they should be taught what purpose feedback serves and why we use it, right? It's to help them. They should also be taught how to receive feedback appropriately by giving them specific actions to engage in, so a list of do's so that they can practice, and how to deliver it if they will be called on to do that. So again, giving them a list of do's and practice around how to provide that feedback. Now let's switch gears a bit and talk about some of the things to consider when planning to train the skills we just talked about. So let's start out broad. Two main aims in training are likely efficacy and efficiency, and for good reasons. We need our new technicians to exit their training and be able to hit the ground running with our clients. When they do, it saves us effort, time, and money. But this takes really careful planning, and Adam will talk about what good training looks like in more detail momentarily. Beyond wanting to ensure our technician or beyond wanting to ensure our training to new technicians is effective and efficient, we also want to make sure it sticks, right? It maintains. So here again, if we can avoid having to retrain new technicians, we can save ourselves a lot of time and money. But a big miss here is what happens outside of training. And what I mean by this is that the contingencies outside of training often aren't well set up to support what's taught in training. Take professionalism, for instance. It's usually the case that expectations such as professional attire are clearly communicated in onboarding training. But many of us, I'm sure, have found ourselves having to address dress code violations with new technicians. And if we think about this more analytically, this might have to do with the fact that very little reinforcement is provided for adhering to these expectations. So while technicians might be told what is and is not appropriate in terms of attire, the next time they hear about their attire, it's usually in the form of a correction. And this might be despite the fact that 95% of the time, their attire is actually appropriate. Now, this is just one example, but the point here is that we need to construct our work environments in such a way that they match the knowledge, skills, and expectations imparted in training. And more often than not, there are critical areas of disconnect between the two. In addition to all that, we should also carefully consider how we are threading in and meeting BACB requirements in training. And I'll just scratch the surface here, but let's look at how training on professionalism skills overlap with the new training technician requirements and ethics code. So the most obvious area of overlap is content area G, ethics and professionalism. But in the previous section, we also talked about some aspects of professionalism that are also captured in content areas B, C, F, and H. Similarly, while there are many ethics code items that might be appropriate to cover in content area G, some might be best discussed in the context of other content areas. Plus, we have to make sure that we meet the required durations across each of these content areas throughout the duration of training. So this can get rather tricky rather quickly. So, to make sure we cover all requirements, as well as guarantee that training is effective, efficient, and sticks, we've got to have a really solid starting point. Unlike with client programming, where everything is going to be completely individualized, training needs to be carefully scoped and sequenced in a way that is standardized and replicable. We suggest that this begin with clear clinical standards and expectations because this will allow you to wrap training and performance expectations around this. Additionally, we recommend that you set up contingencies and systems that will foster, prompt, reinforce, and maintain the skills you teach in training far beyond the scope of initial onboarding. Finally, training should be approached with an eye to quality. It's not enough to just talk through expectations, right? It's not enough to just put a policy or procedure in front of our new technicians. Learners learn best when they're active in the learning process and give the scope and breadth of content that needs to be covered. So this should be done in a way that is carefully sequenced and scaffolded. And Adam will talk a bit more about what this entails and what it should look like. And I would argue that when training is done well, it allows you to avoid a lot of the common problems or challenges we often see our new technicians encounter. I gave the example of dress code violations earlier, but let's consider another common problem, attendance. Whether this is not showing up or tardiness. Well, this is usually regarded as a professionalism skill. What might be at the heart of the problem might be organization or time management. Now, remember, again, our new technicians might be serving in a professional role for the first time in their very young lives, and everything they're learning is new to them. So, unless we effectively train them to organize their tasks and their time, we can't really fault them for struggling with this skill. So, training should include probably multiple practice opportunities with lots of support and prompt fading over time as we see greater independence emerge. Another common area of difficulty for new technicians pertains to feedback. Our new technicians come to us with already long established learning histories, and it's very likely that they equate feedback with punishment. So it's up to us to teach them how to conceptualize and respond to feedback in different ways than they did in the past. And this can be helped along with video models showing examples and non-examples, role plays, and again, some supported practice. Now let's talk about ways you as training directors, clinical directors, and supervisors can support the development of these skills once folks are on the job. And now I'll pass it back to Adam, who will talk about this further.
Great. Thanks, Danielle. And I think what Danielle overviewed are a lot of the things that are probably obvious to anybody who does training of RBTs. You know you need to train the code. You know you need to train in the main topics in the curriculum outline, the TCO items, and so forth. But I think the thing that sometimes gets lost in training of professionalism skills, which Danielle kind of reviewed, is the specificity within the practice setting where they're working. So a lot of professionalism training is very general. A lot of the task item or a lot of the code items for the ethics code are very general because they're intended to meet a wide variety of ethical obligations and potential scenarios that come up across service settings. But one of the things that we really want you to encourage, we want to encourage you doing is that both in your 40-hour and in your professional development work on professionalism and ethics is that you think about which of these are most applicable to these texts in this given setting. Texts that are in a clinic setting, working in an working EI is going to be very different from those in a severe behavior setting versus those that are going in the home in a metro area versus a rural area. So there are a lot of contextual features that when you consider those as part of developing training, then you can make sure that even things like your scenarios and practice examples are relevant to them, that they are things that they are likely going to contact. The solutions that you have are going to be relevant. If there's, for going back to Danielle's example around attendance, if you're working in a metro area where everybody's taking public transit to get to work, there are going to be different solutions than people who are working in a rural area who get stuck in traffic and are driving a vehicle. So you have to think about those considerations when it comes to teaching people professionalism and ethics skills and how to apply this across those different settings. So what we've tried to do is make sure that in any professional development event that is on that topic, you really work with your supervisors who are seeing the issues and then also work directly with your technicians to get information about what are the sticking points for them and embed that in training and then embed that within all of your guidelines and supervision that you provide. So, as Danielle mentioned, we're going to now talk about some of the considerations related or implications of training on ethics and professionalism. And in this section, I'm going to talk about, there are two ideas in here that I've referenced, two articles, one by Linda LeBlanc and colleagues on the Ethics Network, and the second one by Avner Friedland and colleagues, which is on peer observation in behavior analytics settings. We're not going to really dig into these articles right now, but Maddie's going to drop a link in the chat. If you'd like to join us the week of February 9th, we're planning to host just a really informal journal club application discussion. So there's a poll where you can tell us when you might be available for that. We'll schedule something, and then we'll send you these two articles to read beforehand or at least skim beforehand. During the session, we'll do a brief review, discuss the implications of it, and then we're also going to show you some applied examples related to it because they're not exactly directly related to RBT level professionalism skills, but they are very relevant, and they're good exemplars that you can apply in that context. So the first one, which Danielle talked about and you saw in some of those examples around the content that you need to train, is that professionalism training and professionalism skills must happen in a broader context. And that's true of all professional development. It's not just these CE events or these modules that we send somebody to, or here's the code, go read it. It'll eventually be useful to you. But there are things that are embedded within that flow of work. Back to our graphic here that shows us that initial upfront training we provide, and then infusing it within supervision, within working on the case, within prompts that people see in their data collection and practice management platform. So if we take professionalism as example, we may provide a sequence of, let's say, instructor-led training or e-learning modules. This is our example from ProTech. And then supervisors need to anchor that to what they're doing in practice so that people are talking about it, they're doing it, they're getting observation and feedback around it. And then related to professionalism, at the organizational level, you can understand what guidelines do we need to put in place, what clarifications do we need to put. Do we have policies that nobody is following? How are we going to enforce those? Are our consequence systems appropriate? Do we have the right antecedents in place? There are a variety of things that can happen when you start elevating certain professional competencies like professionalism to a level where everybody's working on it, and it just raises the level of awareness, and then you're able to engage in a lot more problem solving around it. So the big idea being you train on certain professionalism topics as part of professional development units, and then you reinforce all of that through practice, through supervision, ongoing practice, observation, and feedback. The second big idea is that in addition to just training and supervision of it, is to have other support functions in place. Establishing an outlet where people are encouraging professional behavior, and they also have a mechanism where they feel like they can report issues or ask questions. Having a forum where they can talk about professional standards, and if there are professional standards that are violated, there's an approach to addressing them that is non-punitive when at all possible, that it's really restorative, that it looks at the broader system. And so one of the examples in the literature that's done that is what Linda LeBlanc and colleagues at Trumpet Behavioral Health did many years ago, which was establish an ethics network. And the goal, it was specifically focused on ethics, but it has ethics and professionalism are all wrapped up. It's one big ball of wax. So ethics, they established this ethics network, and the goal was to really create a system where they could normalize conversations around ethics. They had a place to provide guidance to clinicians related to ethical issues that might arise. And they had a structured framework that everybody in the organization, from the CEO down to the tech on their very first day, it was easy for them to digest and use. And so they created the system across the organization, and they had all these various kinds of roles involved, people that were compensated for the work that they did, volunteers that contributed to it. And they focused on, in this article, they summarized the data from 6 years of gathering data from an ethics hotline. What kinds of issues came up, and how did they respond to those? And so there were a couple components to what they were doing. One was they had an established problem-solving framework. It was a series of steps and some guidance that everybody was trained on, how to take a problem that you might be encountering and work it through these different steps, recognizing that there is a problem, being able to define it clearly so other people understand it, begin generating what are some ideas around the solution. Often people that are encountering the problem, a problem that relates to ethics and professionalism, will be very helpful in developing a solution around it because they understand the context of it and they understand where there are violations or potential gaps that are appearing. Looking at what are the advantages and disadvantages of those solutions, implementing it, and then evaluating it. And so they trained staff to use this framework. They had a shared way of having conversations that would be around this framework, so that someone brought a ethical issue to the ethics committee, they would then process it through these questions. It was general enough, but you could make it specific to your specific issue. Once they did some training on that, then they also had folks create additional resources. And this is a great way to engage, especially if you're a clinic, if you're an organization with multiple clinics, is to engage your local resources, to have people create a set of tools, and materials that can be used to strengthen the professionalism and ethics skills that you're trying to promote. So what they did, this is some examples of that. They created monthly talking points so that up before a holiday occurred, they could talk to their teams about what kinds of issues might arise. They had regular cadence of reviewing specific ethics code items, and that's a good place to make it personalized to what problems is this group of performers going to have in this organization. They had other kinds of events, continuing ed with journal clubs, ethics conversations, and so forth. So what they did was really create a support mechanism around everything related to ethics so that when there are ethical concerns, the only option is not, oh, I can only talk to my supervisor or report it to the board. That can sometimes be a place that people find themselves in, especially if it's an ethical issue that a performer is experiencing with their supervisor. If they feel that's the only reporting route, then there's not a lot of options for them to access other resources in the organization. And that creates a lot of problems. Disengagement, you see increases in gossip, you see issues related to procedural fidelity, even. People are not going to do things the way that they were told to do if they're having a problem with you being the person that told them to do it. So all of those are variables that impact professionalism and ethics. The third kind of consideration, or the third idea here, is to put professionalism, whatever it might be, and I'll show you a sample checklist in a minute. Put that as the first item on the agenda. This is an idea taken from behavior-based or values-based safety, where they would put safety at the top of the agenda. So that it was top of mind, everybody's talking about it. It's part of how we do business. Every meeting, we're going to do a safety check-in on how things are going, whether we've completed our observation and the number of observations we set out to do this week. Are there any incidents that came up that we need to talk about? Are there preventative actions we need to take? When you put professionalism, just like safety, on the top of the agenda, it really sets a tone that it's something that matters. It signals a priority to people that are in the organization, and it creates a standard that they can start to follow. It's also something that if you're talking about it regularly enough, you can prevent drift of certain ethical or professional conduct practices. So much around ethics and professionalism is reactive, telling people either that you are like at the very bottom of the hill and things have slipped a lot and we're really in trouble, or you're starting to see slippage and now we're going to try to bring everybody back on board. So the earlier you can do it and make it as part of the rhythm of work that everybody's going to participate in, the stronger the verbal community becomes around the terminology, the framework. If you adopt that problem solving framework, all of those kinds of things just become embedded in the way of work. There are different kinds of tools you can create to help you do that. This is an example from the values-based safety book where we had an example of elements leaders who are going to be, let's say, focused on improving professional behavior in their organization. They've conducted training, they've created all these resources. Here's what they're going to do. They're going to walk around, and when they attend a leadership meeting, they're going to make sure that safety is the first thing that people are talking about, that they have reviewed incidents and close calls, and there are action plans that have been created and been followed through and followed up on. So this is a BBS example, but in an RBT related meeting, whether it's group supervision, maybe it's a whole team meeting. I've been in very large kind of group case review meetings that happen where you have entire teams, like 30 techs and all the supervisors, and they're all reviewing client data and commenting on it and providing ideas and solutions and so forth. Putting professionalism and safety on there as a top priority item that's something that's talked about, is a good way to embed these topics throughout the flow of work beyond that initial PDU. It might be things like rotating topics related to reviewing code items, some of those ideas from LeBlanc et al., going over items related to documentation, doing a little booster training, showing examples and non-examples of documentation, having people actively engage, do some practice around looking at a session note, critiquing the session note, providing feedback on the session note, and then looking at picking an example from their own case and doing the same kind of work. This is a really good way to continue that continuous learning loop for learners, but also prompts discussion around any barriers that come up. It's also a great opportunity to hit some wins. This could be very short, 3 minutes. Some meetings might be a little bit longer where we go over some of these topics. But it's something where it doesn't become just a laundry list of things that are problems that people have to intervene on, and we can do it at the group level so that it lowers what individual supervisors are having to address with trainees. All right, the fourth one is using peer observation and self-evaluations, which is a popular strategy in the OBM safety literature and in other fields. But it's a way to not put everything related to professional conduct on the supervisor. So often, if you're gonna enforce the code or you're gonna enforce company practices, who has to do the enforcing? The supervisor. All the effort is put on them. So that when supervisors are doing it, then clinical directors or other leaders, center leaders, have to then press on supervisors. And then other things fall by the wayside. Attention, we can't attend to all the things. So there are things that are going to drift, and then we're going to have to bring that back. So peer observation is a sturdy tool that has been used in a number of contexts to recruit the support of the technicians observing one another and providing feedback to one another. And that does not necessarily mean it has to be a lead tech that's providing feedback to entry level techs. It could be RBT1s to another RBT1, lead to lead, BCBA to BCBA, but it's leveraging the number of people that you've got in the organization to normalize feedback around professional conduct, build some self-management and self-awareness around those particular topics, and create accountability around it. So Friedland et al., this is an article that we'll talk about in the journal club follow-up. This was an article where they looked at the literature on using peer feedback, and there wasn't, they did it across different fields, and then they provided some recommendations around how it applies in a behavior analytics setting. So they looked at ways in which peer observations were being used, and they found two things across those different articles. They coded for a lot, but they found two things. They found that in some of the experiments that used peer feedback, there was a difference where the improvements that were made on performance and perception of using peer feedback were significantly improved when peer feedback was transparent. The person that was being evaluated knew they were being evaluated, and they were being evaluated by a peer. Both people knew that they were part of the observation. And it was part of it, going back to that ethics network idea, is that it was part of this shared culture around, I'm not here to catch you doing things wrong, but it's just part of our maintenance of, taking the car to the shop and getting the oil changed. It's part of the regular rhythm. Everybody's part of this. I'm going to be a peer evaluator. You're going to be a peer evaluator of me eventually, or tomorrow, or 10 minutes from now. So the first idea is really that they opened it up to be more. They found that studies where people were aware that it was happening was something that changed the dynamic from sort of a gotcha and the reactivity effects you can see to something that was more proactive and led to better outcomes on performance. The second piece was that I think only one of the studies used, but was more effective, actually used video recordings and did some asynchronous reviews of feedback. And we know that that is also an approach that can be very helpful, especially when people are working in homes and you can't always be there directly for an observation. Having them run a session or having them do session notes or looking at the permanent products of the session and using that to then provide some peer feedback on going back and watching the recording or looking at those deliverables, pausing, rewinding. So you have to adapt it to your setting, but I think both of those contexts, you can kind of get that from this article and the literature that they reviewed, but it's something that you have to think about in terms of the context of your setting. We've worked with large agencies where some of the centers are doing mostly in-home delivery and some of them are only clinic. And so the observation and feedback tools have to be different because those settings are different. The frequency and expectation of how often observation and feedback sessions are occurring, those also have to vary. The Friedland article provided some recommendations to make sure that when you are doing peer feedback or peer observation, that you train people up front to just observe and evaluate performance. that you've got accurate, clear criteria of what they're going to be looking for. They've learned the skills of error detection. Like if I'm doing peer observation of the way session notes are written, I need to be able to evaluate a good versus a bad session note. I need to be able to detect certain errors. The second piece being that they developed a series of activities, not just I'm going to train you and now you go out there in the wild and you evaluate professional behavior in any way that it might show up. But there was levels of complexity that they built this on. And this is another way that you can actually spend professional development is a topic like professional conduct. If we're talking about even just ethical behavior or application to ethics scenarios we might provide someone, those could span over many months of having PDUs that are dedicated to that topic, and your leveling of kinds of different activities that they engage in can build from there. And they show this graphic in there where they first looked at, okay, one activity can be on just learning to evaluate performance. We could use maybe video tools to do that. We could take video examples. Then the next step is evaluating and delivering performance feedback on a peer's performance. Then evaluating and delivering feedback on a peer's feedback. So you already build sort of a pyramidal cascading approach inside of leveling these activities. This is also a really great way to continue to put, people organizations that have career ladders for RBTs or have certain competencies or activities they have to meet to move up a level in the organization. This is a great way to kind of begin to frame that. And then one of the other big points that they recommended was really using group supervision to continue embedding and making ideas around professionalism and feedback and so forth apparent to everybody that's part of that conversation. All right, here we go. Two more. Fifth, public posting. And this is a way, again, we're trying to add in, there are both antecedents and consequences to this side of the equation, but there are things that we can do in terms of alerting people to the professional standards the organization has, various kinds of professional conduct that we're looking for. And one of those ways is public postings. I was recently at a clinic that had a really nice, I didn't include their picture, but this is like a rendering of an idea of what they had. But they had this really big bulletin board that had a section related to RBT duties, and they could see who was assigned to all of them. They had a section with team shout outs. They had some kinds of initiatives that were going on. And so they had the status of those projects in different columns. And then they also had this month's reminders around various kinds of things. And some of it was professionalism, things that maybe we need to tighten up on. There were also things on there related to individual teams. There was graph data around what individual teams were doing related to compliance tasks. So getting session notes in on time. They went in and did some scoring of session notes, and then they were able to give scores related to that. So there's a way to build into just the visibility of the clinic a lot of these kinds of things related to the professional skills that you need to train. If you're not in a setting where you can do that, I've also seen people set up Microsoft Teams or Slack channels that are dedicated to some of these topics and have regular content that's flowing through that just to give people those little nudges throughout the week. All right. And then the last one is clinical rounds. Rounding can mean a lot of different things to people. To some people, when you're rounding, it means I'm just basically walking from treatment room to treatment room in a clinic and seeing if everybody is doing okay. That's probably the least effective set of rounding practices but it's the one I see almost always. There is an on-call BCBA in a clinic, and they are just popping in and out of rooms to make sure everybody's okay. They might have some conversation with people. They might check up on their own clients, but there's really no purpose to the walk around. There's no purpose to the rounding. Then there's clinical rounds that actually mean that we're having like a debrief or a huddle about a case, and we're going to be reviewing specific aspects of the case and what needs to happen today, if there are any barriers, doing a pulse check on the client that day, if they had a poor night's sleep, changes in diet, interactions with caregivers, all those kinds of things. In rounding, whatever format it takes, just like adding safety and professionalism to the top of the agenda for every meeting, you can do the same thing in rounding. You can add topics or observations related to professionalism. So if you've got people who are going around doing rounds, supervisors who are going to be checking in on how people are doing, even if it isn't counted as direct observation or direct supervision. These are some of the things you might include. You might have specific high yield targets that you want everybody to engage in. And these are the kinds of things that when I'm going around as a supervisor, I'm looking for these specific behaviors. They may not be applicable in every room that I pop into, but these are some of the things I'm looking for. And you can have this kind of checklist, just like a procedural fidelity checklist. Have this checklist and align it with some of the cues. Like, here's some prompts you might give people. Here's some praise statements you can use if you see people engaging in these behaviors. Here's some corrective actions. It may not be that the corrective action is corrective feedback. It could be modifying something about the environment. It could be pulling some of the various kinds of interventions that are on the performance diagnostic checklist. But this is a way to give purpose to what people are doing when they're going around, looking around, talking around on just as part of the daily flow of work. You're adding some things that are going to reinforce everything that you're doing in that upfront training. Back to some examples of tools from safety. Here's that expanded checklist from our VBS book, where the leaders, now what I just talked about, this is more of like what supervisors are doing or what a lead or a senior technician might be doing. But then above them, you also need support so that it's just embedded as part of the system and that this thing doesn't start to drift. And one of the ways of doing that is making sure that your clinical directors, clinical service managers, regional directors, whoever's in these environments, whether it's virtual or in person, is observing that this kind of stuff is happening. If we say we're going to be really focusing on a couple of core things related to professionalism skills, then we want to make sure that it's happening in these different forms where we said it's going to happen. And so one of the ways that leaders can support that is by having different checkpoints where they're going to be looking that those things are being implemented and they have some guidance on what am I looking for. So this example checklist is set up for safety where a leader says, okay, when I go to a leadership team meeting and when I go to the weekly safety meeting and I'm out on a job site doing observation, these are the kinds of things that I'm looking for that would tell me that these systems and practices we put in place are actually working. And then having that leader also engage in some self-evaluation. This week, this month, did I do these various things? And if you see a lot of no's in here, then it tells you need to modify something about what you're doing. Because if we're going to kind of, in terms of sustainability of these, of the professional conduct practices, and we're going to keep this going, we're going to need leaders to support all of that. And it's going to happen in a cascading approach. It's not just one level. It's going to be all of everybody working together up and down and across verticals. So this is no small point. This is an area, if you were going to try to clean up professionalism and professional conduct in your organization, this is where you would start. You would start by building in exactly not only what do we need to see when we're doing those walkarounds, what do we want people to engage in, but how are we going to get leaders to support that? And if you're in a multi-site organization, you start with you start with one clinic, you start with one supervisor who's gung-ho to kind of try this out, to do some peer observation. They know it won't, may not go right the first time, but they're gonna modify it as they go along. We often say, make a big mess in a small spot first, and then you can clean it up quickly, rather than say, you know what? I'm the training director. I've got this great idea, some observation, love the idea. I'm going to create some tools. I'm going to send them out there. And this is what we often hear from people who are responsible for training. They create a lot of stuff, a lot of resources, and then nobody uses them or nobody knows about them. So this is the place to start with a small spot where you can show some success. Use that as a case study that's going to support other leaders doing it and roll out from there. Be cautious about taking those kinds of tools, these kinds of practices, and just doing a broad sweep, implementing them everywhere. It doesn't go as you'd like it to. So that kind of summarizes these main points. Danielle talked about a lot of the competencies and content related to professionalism and ethics, but then there's a way of having to get it into the flow of work, getting it to be something that's sustainable. And building the sustainability around that involves understanding that everything you're teaching is part of a larger context, and then putting the support mechanisms in place so that those things do sustain over time. There are a lot of things you can do, but make sure that you're not just intervening on the antecedent side, that you're not just doing training and doing some public posting and you're putting some, job aids and support. That's great. But we all have encountered many, many kinds of wall signs, job aids, email reminders, all sorts of things that have gone out to support performance and then not had any weight put on the consequential end. And that's really important to balance out those two. And these kinds of supports can really help balance out that C side of the equation. So that kind of wraps up what we wanted to go over today. Again, we hope you'll fill out that clinical leaders forum webinar, or excuse me, form in the chat so we know that you're interested. We'll contact you about when registration opens in February. We also, if you want to talk about the Fralin article and the LeBlanc article, again, we're going to do a journal club the week of the 8th or the week of the 9th. So fill out that poll in the chat and we'll send out a calendar invite with a link to the two articles, and we'll provide more conversation and application to some real scenarios that you might be encountering. Look out for our upcoming webinars. We post them on LinkedIn and also as part of our newsletter. And then feel free to contact us. In the newsletter, there'll be a button if you'd like to learn more about our 40-hour RBT training, our professional development products like ProTech that we talked about today. We also have a BCBA library of CE or CE library for BCBAs, and we offer learning management system hosting services. So you can actually get all of that to be in one system. Trainees that are coming for their 40-hour, professional development, BCBAs, they can all come to one system, get that whole library of resources in place. We do auto-generate certificates. We'll help work with clients on building some of their own content into the platform. And then we also do more extensive projects by working with organizations on improving clinical and training systems. So that takes us to the very end. Thank you all for being here.